Guille. Thank you very much. Thank you very much, Guille, for organizing this event, and thank you very much to the members of CFA Society Mexico who have joined us today. We are delighted to have Helen Lackner talking to us about the crisis in Yemen, which is of course very important for the world economy for reasons that Helen will discuss. But basically, we want to have a little bit more of context about the crisis that is going on in the Red Sea with all the shipments. We want to know what's going on in Yemen. We want to have a broader context. We want to put the crisis in a broader context to be able to assess how long this crisis will last. But before we enter into the topic, let me introduce to you Miss Helen Lackner. Helen Lackner is a writer resident in the UK. She's an academic and researcher who has been working on Yemen for 50 years. She's the author of many books, including Yemen in Crisis, which I highly recommend, Why Yemen Matters, Yemen's Successful Peaceful Transitions from Autocracy, Understanding the Yemeni Crisis, Yemen in Crisis, and she has been awarded the Grand Prix of Literary Associations for the book Yemen in Crisis, which I highly recommend. Helen, we couldn't be happier to have you here. We believe that you are the right person to talk to us about Yemen and to, as I mentioned at the beginning, put the crisis in the Red Sea in a broader context about what's going on. So thank you very much for coming.
Well, thank you very much for inviting me, and I hope I managed to say something interesting and useful to your members.
No, of course. So let's start. I mean, we want to be this more like a conversation, first between both of us, and then we will open it to the audience. So we have some slides, but those slides are mostly background material. We are more interested to hear what you have to say about Yemen, and to allow you more freedom and to make it more fluid. We want this to be more of a conversation. So let's talk a little bit about the recent history of Yemen. I mean, if you Google Yemen, you will see pictures that are breathtaking, and that you will see images that are great. So and that seems to be an image that is in people's mind, and they basically date from after independence, from the post World War II. So now the country is the main actor of the attacks on international ships that are disrupting international trade. So what happened? Can you talk to us a little bit about the history of Yemen in the post World War II era?
Yes, well, I think as basically after the World War II, you had two states in Yemen at the beginning. One which was a British colony of Aden and the protectorates in the south, and what was the Imamate, the Zaydi Imamate with the capital Sana'a in the north. This went on until 1962, when in Sana'a there was a Republican revolution. If you remember and notice that in that period you had a lot of Republican and vaguely socialist movements in the Arab world, I mean, particularly Nasserism. And from 63 to 67, you had a liberation movement in the Aden and protectorates area, which led to independence in 1967. So from 62 until 1990 in Sana'a, you had the Yemen Arab Republic, which from 78 onwards was run by Ali Abdallah Saleh. And he is an important leader because he then continued to rule what was later the Republic of Yemen when the two states unified in 1990. And he stayed in charge until basically 2012. So he's an important person that one needs to be aware of. So basically, you also had in Yemen in the second half of the 20th century, both states were fairly poor states. And although the PDRY was much smaller in population, sorry, the PDRY is the People's Democratic Republic of Yemen, which was created after independence and was indeed the only Marxist regime that existed in the Arab world, being far more closer to the Soviet Union than, for example, other states in the region like Syria. So I think the important element you have is that both states were fairly poor, and particularly the YR had a fairly large population. I forgot to put a map on this, but if you look at it, it has basically a very mountainous area, which receives the monsoon and which created the possibility for things like agriculture, like rain-fed agriculture in the region, which was the main activity of the majority of the people. So although you had these two states, you also, and after 1990, you did have a lot of political difficulties and tensions, partly internal ones and partly connected with the outside world, specifically with obviously the Cold War. You had the PDRY aligned with the Soviet Union and the YR much more aligned with the US and the West. And after unification in 1990, of course, the issue of the Soviet Union no longer existed because that also ended that year. And you had a state, there was a creation of the Republic of Yemen. And basically from 1990 until the civil war started in 2015, you had an increasing set of tensions within the country, partly because of the nature of the Saleh regime. It was particularly predatory. And although oil was discovered, but its quantities were never big, the highest oil production that ever existed was 400,000 barrels per day, which, is peanuts compared to what's produced in Saudi Arabia or other countries. And unfortunately, most of that, the income from that oil was not distributed or used to build up a post-oil economy. It wasn't used to support education, health, and all the main things that were needed. But it was, and so you had a situation where basically the population which was increasing very fast, was also getting poorer and poorer as a consequence of the misuse of the oil income and also of the very limited alternative sources of income that happened. So you had this kind of frustration that went on throughout the country. And at the same time, in the far north, you had the rise of the Houthi movement. And in the former PDRY, you had the rise of southern separatism. So you had strong movements that were developing and that were challenging the central authority, while the other areas which didn't have those movements were also suffering economically. So these things eventually ended up with the uprisings of the 2011, i.e. what was known as the Arab Spring in the Middle East, and which connected with, basically resulted in the removal of Ali Abdullah Saleh as president, but not his removal. He was not forced out of the country, and nor was he forced out of running his party, which was the main political party in previous years. And what you had a Gulf Cooperation Council agreement, which set up a transition that was supposed to last from 2012 to 2014, with a new president who was the Saleh's vice president, and which had a number of features that were supposed to bring about a serious change in basically create a new constitution and create a more democratic and more acceptable regime to the population, as well as being more acceptable to the international community. So that was sort of guided, or there was a sort of group of ambassadors who were basically supporting and supposedly guiding this transition. And one of the main elements of the transition was the National Dialogue Conference, which lasted for 10 months between 2013 and 2014, and which was supposed to lay the foundations for what would create the new constitution. But while this was going on, the Houthis participated in this, but while it was going on, they also consolidated their power, and also that the particular transitional government that existed during that period was particularly ineffective and particularly corrupt. I mean, in Yemen, people said this was the worst, most corrupt government they'd ever had. So this allowed the Houthis to rise and to increase their power, and they took over more parts. So, I mean, always based in the far north, but they basically were moving gradually south towards Sana'a. And basically by late 2014, they actually took Sana'a, which is the capital. And by that time, they had, it's always very confusing when we talk about Yemeni politics, because by that time they were in alliance with Saleh against the transitional regime. So that basically Saleh and his military and security people helped them to take Sana'a and to basically run the country for the next year or two until they fell out and the Houthis actually killed Saleh in 2017. Now, I understand you want me to talk a little bit more about who the Houthis are. Shall I go
Yes.
on about the Houthis very briefly?
Yeah. So just to, I mean, this is clearly a very complete overview of the recent history of Yemen. So the country was divided in two after the allies of the U.S. and the allies of the USSR. Then eventually, when the USSR disappears, the country reunifies under the command of Saleh,
Yeah.
who then goes on to govern until the early 2010s. In the meantime, a bunch of tensions accumulate throughout the country. Then the Houthis become an increasingly important presence. First, they are rivals of Saleh, then they are his allies, and then eventually they kill him. So who are these Houthis? Who are they? What do they want? Why are they so important? And just to bring this into the context of today, I mean, I believe we all are aware that the Houthis are the ones who are leading at least the attacks against the international shipping. So who are they? What do they want? Why are they so crucial to Yemeni's history?
Yeah, I mean, what they want is power. So that's the quick answer. I can then go into more
Everybody wants
details
power.
of who they are. Well, they don't just want power, they've gained an enormous amount of power in the last 10 years. But let's explain a little bit about who they are. They're basically a religious revivalist movement of one particular branch of Shia Islam. So while Iran has one branch of Shia Islam, which is well known and were normally commonly known as Twelvers, the Houthis are a branch of the Zaydis, who are a different branch of Shiism, but they have some connection and they share certain beliefs with the Iranians. And indeed, the Houthis have been increasing their connections with the religious approach and political approach of Iran. So basically, they were a revivalist movement, and they ran 6 wars against the Saleh regime between 2004 and 2010. And in the course of these wars, they became stronger and stronger. And many people say, and I think there's a good logic for saying it, which is that the Houthis are very good at war, but they don't know about peace, and they don't know how to live in peace and to run a government. So although they were not particularly close to Iran when the civil war started in 2014-15, they've become closer and closer, partly to differentiate themselves from the ordinary Zaydis, who are much less aggressive than they are. But by now, during the civil war, and they basically have got to a situation where they control 2/3 of Yemen's population and 1/3 of the territory and most of the Red Sea coast, which is obviously of great concern to people at the moment. And militarily, they have been winning and become increasingly powerful, partly because of their military skills, but also very much because the people who form the internationally recognized government and who are, as I said, internationally recognized government, and who are supposedly running the country from what's now the temporary capital of Aden, are extremely divided amongst themselves. And so you have a united and ideologically tight and very authoritarian regime run by the Houthis versus an extremely divided government, which one way of quickly explaining how divided it is, since 2020, instead of having one president and possibly one vice president, it has a presidential leadership council, which has one president and 7 vice presidents. And each one of them represents a different faction. And they spend at least as much time arguing and fighting each other as they do fighting the Houthis. And at the same time, they also between them, they have those who are very strongly supported by the Saudi regime and those who are supported by the Emirati regime from the United Arab Emirates. So you basically have a very, you have the Houthis building up their strength with some financial and technical military support from Iran versus another a group of very divided people who get this, who have what support they have, but it's very half-hearted support. So, for example, the Saudis promised to give them $1 billion to sort out a whole host of financial issues, but that was 2 years ago. And of that, they've already by now received about, half of that in tranches, in bits and pieces. So they're never given enough, for example, to pay the government staff, which is one of the major issues. So that's one reason you have this great division at the moment between the two parts of the country. And although if you look at a map, which unfortunately I forgot to put on this, you have much, the area that's supposedly controlled by the government is much bigger than the area controlled by the Houthis, but it's a basically mostly desert area and very low population density. So that's why you have the situation where the Houthis are controlling basically 2/3 of the country's population. So I think it's very important to realize that although the Houthis are supported by Iran, they are not, as is constantly said, Iran proxies. The Houthis have their own objectives, and the Houthis do what they think they should do. If that happens to coincide with what the Iranians would like, then that's great. They're quite happy. But if it doesn't coincide, they will carry on and do what they want to do. So, for example, the Iranians told them not to take Sana'a in 2014, and they went and took Sana'a because that's what they were planning to do. The Iranians told them not to try and attack and further south, but they did because that's what they wanted to do. So they are not, and that's very important because everybody's always saying Iran backed Houthis, Iran backed Houthis. That is sort of a single word. And the reality is that, the Houthis do what Iran likes if that is part of their actual plan, not because the Iranians tell them to do it. And I think that's particularly relevant now when we look at the Red Sea situation, because it's not, although there is a supposed spy ship, Iranian spy ship, not far somewhere in the Red Sea that connects with that kind of can communicate with the Houthis. My belief is that if that is doing anything, what it is doing is passing on the kind of technical information to the Houthis about who owns what ship or which particular ships might be suitable targets or whatever. It is not actually determining what the Houthis are going to do. And I mean, I think at the moment when we look at the situation in the Middle East, it's quite difficult, but, to look at, the situation in the Middle East, I think it's really important to remember why the Houthis are attacking ships in the Red Sea. And I think, that really is the crucial thing, because the Houthis have been extremely explicit throughout that they are doing it because of the war against Gaza and in support of the Palestinians, and that they will stop attacking ships as soon as this war, as there is a ceasefire and humanitarian necessities are allowed into Gaza. And I do think they mean it. I don't always believe what the Houthis say, in fact, but on this particular case, I think that, they really will do it, and they're really doing this. They have two main motivations for doing what they're doing. One is a real fundamental ideological belief in support of Palestine. And the second one is that it has completely transformed their position internally and internationally. I mean, internally, people who were ruled or who are ruled by the Houthis do not particularly like them, and that's being very polite about it. But because Yemenis on all fronts and everywhere support Palestine, these actions of the Houthis have suddenly improved their popularity by multiples. I mean, they're now popular. They're popular not just in the area they rule, but they're popular throughout Yemen. And indeed, they're popular way beyond Yemen. I mean, living in UK, you know, I come across people on who are supporters of Palestine who think the Houthis are absolutely wonderful. You know, and these people, if you'd asked them a year ago, mentioned the word Houthi, they wouldn't even have asked, who are they? They would have said, what on earth is this? So, you know, it's not new. It's a complete new phenomenon. And I'm concerned that this new popularity, and particularly this popularity outside of the region, is something that may, as they say in English, go to their heads, you know, make them think that they can go have basically expand their ambitions beyond what they already are, which is a problem. So I'll try and come very briefly to the internal situation in Yemen and what would have happened if the Gaza war hadn't happened, which is that you know, if you, as of last October, say pre-7th of October, or even a few weeks after that, there were negotiations going on between the Houthis and the Saudis. Now, there'd been a ceasefire that had expired, lasted only 6 months in 2022, but although it had expired, it was really largely still effective, and no serious fighting had been going on in Yemen throughout from basically early 2022 till recently, really. And there were direct and open public negotiations between the Houthis and the Saudis. And so they were on the point of signing an agreement, or at least most people thought that they were going to sign an agreement. And a number of things that were problematic had been overcome. I mean, one of them was that the Houthis originally wanted the Saudis to sign any agreement as participants, which would have left them open to accusations of war crimes. But the Saudis persuaded them to let them sign as mediators. And so that had been agreed. The other thing that had been agreed was that the Saudis would pay the salaries for all government staff for at least 1 year, and that included the military security staff of the Houthis. You know, of course, it included ceasefire and secure borders for the Saudis. I mean, that was the main point. I should have said it first. And finally, because the Saudis were signing as mediators and not participants, the agreement would formally have been between the Presidential Leadership Council, i.e. the internationally recognized government, and the Houthis. And this would have left the UN Special Envoy, who has been active for many, many years, and we're now on the fourth one of them, to follow up with basically intra-Yemeni negotiations to reach some kind of peace agreement. Now, all this is completely on hold as a result of what's been happening. And on hold, again, may be the polite way of putting it. Some people say that this agreement is completely dead, but I think it's probably on hold. And what's really important about it is that even if it happens, it does not solve the internal Yemeni problems, which we have briefly mentioned and which I think, you know, are worth mentioning. I think I'd like to mention them briefly, and then maybe we can focus on the Red Sea situation. If we have enough time, I'm talking too much.
No. Go ahead. Go ahead. We're listening, so go ahead.
But there's basically a very fundamental issue, set of fundamental issues that Yemen has to face. The first one is that it's socially and politically fragmented. It's always had a lot of variations, but what has happened in the last 10 years, or even maybe want to say the last 20 years, is that there's been increasing fragmentation, which has been worsened and worsened and worsened regionally and in other respects, for example, in sectarian respects and in terms of social allegiances. Basically, from the period of the Saleh regime, which operated a basically divide and rule situation, and very much worsened now with the civil war, which has now been going on. You know, we're now about to enter the 10th year. Was it the 9th year? It started in 15. So, you know, that's one element. The second element is that Yemen has a very, very weak economy, and that had, you know, it had a weak economy, which is now more or less collapsed. And one of the symptoms of this, which is probably of greater interest to your members, is the issue of the central bank. Now, in the beginning of the civil war, there was somehow an agreement which allowed the Central Bank of Yemen to continue operating from Sana'a. But in September 2016, the then president of the internationally recognized government, indeed, as many people were told, against the advice of the World Bank and the IMF, decided to transfer the headquarters of the bank from Sana'a to his temporary capital in Aden. And the result has been that there's basically two central banks, one of them which has the SWIFT code and all the international authorizations, and the other one which has all the technical competence and capacities and various other technical things, which I'm afraid I don't know exactly what they are. And so the result has been over time, and the main thing that happened as a result is that most government staff, and that represents about 1.2 million people. So if you think of dependents and everybody, we're now talking about basically 6 to 7 million out of a total population of 30 million. People have suddenly basically ceased to receive their regular incomes. Now, the response of the new central bank in Aden to this problem was to print money. I think it's a fairly well-known response. It's happened elsewhere. But the result is that if you look at the situation today, is that the value of the real, of the US dollar in the internationally recognized government area is about 1,600 reals to the dollar. In the Houthi-controlled area, it's about 520 or 530. And that's basically because what the Houthis have said is they're not allowing the new notes, which are very slightly different, to circulate in their area. So in the area, basically, only old notes are allowed to circulate. And they are basically in varying levels of complete collapse and stuck together with sellotape, etc., etc. Because Yemen is very much a cash economy. I mean, they've tried to introduce e-money and they've managed it up to some extent, but really, you're talking about very much a cash economy. The other fundamental issue is that the country is extremely dependent on external support. It's partly dependent on imports, which is very important. Basically, the main food staples, wheat, rice, tea, sugar, and those things that are the absolute basics for survival, 90% of that is imported. Fruit and veg and some meats, they can do, they can cope. They used to be more or less self-sufficient. But the basic staples are almost entirely imported, which also means that these things are affected now by the new situation in the Red Sea, in addition to the problems brought about from exports of grains from Ukraine, etc., to very considerably increased prices, which means that the humanitarian needs are even greater. And again, we could talk about that a little bit if we have time or people are interested. And politically internally, you have, a rising southern separatist movement within the internationally recognized government area. And that is a big problem. And as I said, of the 7 vice presidents, they represent at least 3 or 4 different views, because some of them are in favor of unification, some represent different political parties, some represent southern separatism, so there's a whole host of options and cross checks. But there's also an international element, which is that there is an increasing rivalry between the Saudis and the Emiratis, which very much affects the internationally recognized government and will certainly affect further Yemeni negotiations to achieve peace. And if you look beyond the region and you're looking at the interest, people talk about the US and the Western interest. Basically, the US, a colleague once used to say, and that was 15 years ago, she used to say, the US doesn't have a Yemen policy, it has a counterterrorism policy. And I think there's a lot of truth to that with respect to the UK and European states. So if you look at, for example, the type of support of, supposedly development support that's been given to Yemen prior to the humanitarian crisis, if you look at from 1990 to 2010, for example, you'll see percentage decrease in support for things like rural development, like industry, like education and health. And as a parallel, you'd have an increased support in security, training police, training military, etc. So there's been, that's been a very much an important element of what's happened over that period. So I think I've settled with the fundamental issues. Would you like us to talk briefly about the Red Sea?
Yeah. Yes, please. Please, let's do it. So what I've gathered from here is that, I mean, I don't want to use the term proxy war because you explicitly said that is not the case, but it seems to me that there is the domestic tensions that built up over 50 years. And then on top of that, there are all these other powers that are competing for influence over Yemen, given its strategic location and given that there are some de facto alliances of convenience that play well for the powers that have an influence there. So yeah, let's focus on the Red Sea. Let's focus on the Red Sea.
Yeah, so I mean, the Red Sea, as everybody knows, has the Suez Canal at one end and the Bab al-Mandab at the other, which is a very narrow strait. Now, if you look at who's controlling the different bits, at the moment, basically, and of course, Saudi Arabia has a lot of the eastern coast, and the rest of the eastern coast of the Red Sea is controlled by Yemenis. So the first part, the top part, is controlled by the Houthis, and the bottom part is controlled supposedly by one of the vice presidents of the internationally recognized government. In fact, a guy who is the nephew of former President Saleh and who is not a separatist, and who is clearly, he was a military man. Now, although that is the case, the Houthis are managing to attack ships in the southern part of the Red Sea and even on the western part of the Gulf of Aden. I really should have brought a map. And that's because there are mountainous areas nearby, so the Houthis can set up their launching places, pretty close on top of the mountains, and therefore they can reach. Again, do not ask me for any technical aspects on anything military. I'm completely useless. But basically, the Houthis ideologically fully support the Palestinians. And as we also just said, they are benefiting from their activities in the Red Sea, nationally and internationally in terms of the support they're getting. Now, what happened is that, when they first started, they tried to shoot various missiles and drones towards the southern part of Israel, which is the absolute maximum range that their equipment could go. But then they promptly figured out that attacking the ships the ships in the Red Sea was far more effective. And it certainly has been very effective. I mean, I think, as we all know, something like 30% of much of the local trade goes through that area and goes through the Red Sea and the Suez Canal. And the Houthis have been very explicit that they're only targeting any ship that has any connection with Israel, whether it's going there, coming from there, delivering there, being ownership or whatever. And then, of course, after the Americans and the Brits started bombing them, they've added anything to do with the British or Americans amongst their targets. So, and they claim, and I saw a figure today that they were pointing out that any ship captain, all they need to do is inform the Houthis that they have no connection with Israel, and then they will be allowed to travel freely. And indeed, they issued today, I should have written it down, that something like 2,800 and something ships have traveled perfectly freely the whole of December and January, I think. Without any problems. But in fact, it seems that the amount of shipping that's been going through the Red Sea has gone down by about 40%, I think. if not more. And the other side effect, of course, has been that those who are going through are paying much higher rates in terms of insurance, and those that are not going through are paying much higher rates in terms of the cost of travel, because traveling around the the Cape of Good Hope and the whole of Africa, obviously uses more time, fuel, etc. So that this is having quite an impact. And I understand from some other things that I've read that this is also happening at a time when there's problems in your part of the world around the Suez Canal, the Panama Canal, for completely different reasons, which I understand are much more technical and not political reasons. But so there is, there are certain constraints at the moment happening in world shipping, which may or may not affect, different aspects in different ways. Now, here in Europe, we're told that we're going to be paying more for our goodies because they're costing a little bit more to ship them. But I can't, I think I saw a figure saying it's likely to have an impact of 0.07% on the cost of things that we're buying, of particular items. So it's not, it's not going to to create a major economic crisis, but it's certainly politically quite a problem. And in terms of Israel, although it has reduced the traffic in one of the Israeli ports, Eilat, by 80%, it hasn't had a very strong impact on some other Israeli ports, which are the more important ports, though the Israelis are now apparently downloading stuff in Dubai and having it brought across overland. But you have the basic, I think, impact of the Red Sea situation is first that it's transformed the situation in Yemen, in the sense that now that the Americans and the Brits are bombing Yemen, this means that we now have a renewal of bombing in Yemen, which basically had stopped, of aerial bombing, which basically had stopped in April 2022. So we'd had almost 2 years without any airstrikes on Yemen. And now they're resuming, and I understand from people in Yemen that, from what they hear, because in terms of, they don't go and inspect things, but that these particular bombs are much bigger and heavier and louder and more shattering than the ones that the Saudis and the Emiratis used to drop. But also it makes people much more concerned, and they're obviously afraid of, of civilian suffering and civilian people being hit. So it's a very difficult situation. And of course, it has put an end. We then also have the issue of the Americans having labeled the Houthis terrorists, which also would affect, for example, if there was any success in the discussions between the Houthis and the Saudis, it would be very difficult to implement the decision that the Saudis would pay for the salaries, because they, it would involve financial transfers, and that would be very, problematic with the situation of this designation. Another impact of the designation on the Yemeni population, of course, is that there are thousands, possibly more than a few million Yemenis, who to a greater or lesser extent are dependent on the remittances they receive from their friends and families, mostly in Saudi Arabia and the peninsula, but also in Europe and the US, who are sending money to keep them afloat. And as we've said, the economy is in a very, very bad condition. So the importance of these remittances is vast. And, although the Americans have said that they're going to do things to allow humanitarian input, goods to continue, both the humanitarian organizations have complained very, very seriously about the risks. But already, if Western Union, which is one of the major money transfer outfits in the world, has already stated that they've stopped making any transfers to Yemen. So this is the kind of thing that really affects the situation for Yemenis, and which of course has an impact on how Yemenis view the outside world. They certainly see, Yemenis see, they basically do not have a very positive view of either the US or the UK as a result of the bombing. particularly since fundamentally everybody in Yemen recognized that the Houthi activities are in support of Palestine, and everybody, I mean, let's say 99.9% of Yemenis are supporters of Palestine. So I think I will let you speak maybe for a few minutes or answer
no,
something or
no, yeah, no,
whatever,
thank you. Let's,
anything we've forgotten to talk or to raise.
yeah. So this is your picture from one of your many travels to Yemen, and it's obviously a very beautiful and hopeful picture. So before we open up to the public, let's try to, I mean, it's gonna be hard, but let's try to end up on a positive note, inspired by your own image. I mean, you can see here a rainbow. So first of all, why don't you talk to us a little bit about this picture, and let's try to close on a hopeful note. Is there any room for improvement? I mean, clearly, when and if the war in Gaza is over, uh, the bombing will stop. I'm not sure that overall. I'm not sure, because Yemen has attention now, and having attention is, it can be both of a blessing and a curse. So I assume that once the war in Gaza, and therefore the attacks on the shipping ends, Yemen will lose all the attention, which may be a curse and a blessing. But let's try to cheer it up, if there is any room for that. So why don't we try that, inspired by your picture?
Well, as you said, there's always room for improvement. And the worst things are, the more room there is for improvement. I mean, I like that particular picture because it's of a town called Hajjah in the Yemeni highlands, and that the castle at the top is one of the places where the Imam in the 40s and 50s and yeah, in the 40s and 50s was keeping his political opponents, some of whom survived and joined the revolution after 1962. But it's a highland mountain which is which is reasonably prosperous, basically because it's in the Western Highlands where there is enough rain for agriculture and you can see a lot of trees. So I think the positive sides is that I do believe that the Houthis would stop their Red Sea activities if the Gaza war stops and humanitarian assistance is allowed to move in. I suspect, I mean, the situation in Gaza, as I'm sure we all know, is getting worse by the second, and we're getting, thousands and thousands of people have been killed, and thousands more have been wounded, and many thousands more are being starved because, food is not allowed to be. The Israelis are not letting food in. So but I also think that the pressure on Israel is increasing. And I believe that it seems to me that the only way that this will stop is if the Israelis change their prime minister. And it seems to me that we're getting to a situation where this should happen because the situation seems to me untenable. But in any case, I do believe that if that happens, the Houthis will stop these attacks. Theoretically, according to what they say, the Americans and Brits would then presumably stop their own attacks. And which we didn't mention, the new operation from the EU, which officially started on Monday, will then be able to go home. And, so that element would end. And assuming that happened, we can revive the negotiations that were on hold. And if they can be, if an agreement can, and the agreement was very close to being reached. So if such an agreement can happen, then, we could look at the possibility of negotiations between the different Yemeni factions to achieve some kind of peace. I don't think, I think there's two problems. One, of course, is that the Houthis are obviously, are likely to increase their ambitions and their demands as a result of what's happened the last few months, which will be very difficult for the others to agree, and that there still is very little sign of an improvement in terms of the political unity of the anti-Houthi movement and the internationally recognized government. But in the second case, if the right political pressure is put from outside, then, things could improve. And that would, require international influence on both, mostly on the Emirates, but to help, to try and keep the country unified and get it going. And then eventually to provide, much of the humanitarian and development support that would be needed to reestablish a viable country in Yemen, or, which is something that, I'm sure the overwhelming majority of Yemenis would like to see, and they certainly want to see an end to the fighting, and they want what everybody else wants: reasonable living conditions, health, education, earning a living, and being able to concentrate on those aspects and on their personal and family relationships and their friends, rather than on weapons and fighting. So hopefully this will happen maybe this decade.
Inshallah. So
Inshallah, as they say.
so let's open up for questions from the audience, and yeah, we are here. So if anybody has any comment or question, please go ahead. I have another question, and that's I mean, and this hits close to home, and we talked about it while we were preparing the meeting, Helen, which is the water situation, and this hits close to home because right now in Mexico there is a severe drought in Mexico City that is basically affecting all of the Central Valley of the country, and there is a Yemeni dimension there because, from my understanding, Yemen was one of the first countries in the world that started experiencing the effects of climate change in the form of mega droughts, crops that were going well. So what is the Yemeni experience with the effects of climate change, and do you think there is anything that we can learn on how to avert climate and weather disaster from them?
Well, thanks for asking that. And actually, I'm just about to publish a policy brief on environmental issues in Yemen, so I can send you a copy if you're interested. But basically, yes, for a long time, whenever I was talking about water and drought and water scarcity, etc., I used to say, Yemen is way ahead of everyone else in terms of climate change and global warming. But now I have to stop saying that because the rest of the world has caught up. And for years, if you look back at media things from 10 or 15 years ago, they will talk about Sana'a as being the first capital that will run out of water. And now that's no longer true. I think, you in Mexico you certainly have beaten them. And last year we also had issues in Cape Town, which, okay, is not a capital, but it's still a major city. And within Yemen, there's another city called Taiz, where I worked on a water project in the mid-90s. And at that time, in Taiz, about half the city was connected to the municipal supply. And of those households that were connected to the municipality supply, they received water once every 60 days, 60, once every 2 months. Then through these various projects that happened on and off, at times this went up to every 45 days. The best I ever heard, because whenever I met anybody from Taiz, asked, how often do you get water? And, the best I think I ever heard was once every 30 days. And that is the half households who are connected. So the other half are not connected in the first place. So, and if you look at Sana'a, I remember going to Sana'a in the 1980s, and every new house had lots and lots of bathrooms, and every tap was leaking. They were just dripping away like mad. By the 2000s, every bathroom you ever went into was full of buckets that were full of water that people were keeping, and none of them were leaking. And they got water 2 or 3 times a week in Sana'a. And again, in Sana'a, some areas and new areas, including sort of fancy middle class, wealthy areas, are not connected to the water network. So overall, Yemen basically consumes 1/3 water more than is replenished, and it has no rivers. So all the water supply is either replenishable groundwater, fossil water, or water that is coming directly, basically rain collection water. And as in most other countries, between 85 and 90% of the country's water is used in agriculture. So in a sense, the problem can be solved because all you need to do is to transfer a portion of the agricultural water to domestic use, and that will solve the problem. Because you already have had now for 20 years, areas and villages that have been abandoned because the water has run out completely. And eventually, the way things are going, people would be forced to migrate out first from the water scarce area to more watered areas, and eventually out of the country. Now, it's really important to have a sense of the geography. Yemen has a very long coast, and eventually, and sooner rather than later, desalination will have to be used for some of the major cities. I mean, basically Hodeidah, Aden, Mukalla, and all the fishery communities along the coast. But I think it's also worth remembering that, desalination, it's a solution, but it's not a perfect solution because it creates, and particularly if you're looking at the Red Sea, the brine that is produced by a desalination plant basically makes the sea water much worse, and that's particularly acute in the Gulf on the other side of the peninsula, where there's more desalination plants and the area is smaller. But that would also become relevant, elsewhere in terms of its impact on fisheries, its impact on marine life in general. So, desalination is useful and cannot be avoided. But you also need to remember when you talk about Yemen is that the major areas, populated areas like Hajj, for example, or the capital Sana'a, are at over 2,000 meters altitude. So you're talking about pumping the water up one set of mountain, down another valley, and up to a third one to get to these places. So the cost, is basically prohibitive. So the issue fundamentally is one of, transforming agriculture to avoid deep well irrigation and to develop, less water demanding crops, and the transfer of water from agriculture into domestic use, and that means being properly enforced. And this hasn't happened in Yemen basically because most regulations were not enforced. During the Saleh regime, he was very happy to encourage the few wealthy landowners to extract more water for their high value agriculture and export crops. I mean, both export crops like grapes and mangoes and such like, but also locally consumed crops like gat, which is a well-known drug that people are quite upset about in Yemen, to some extent, even though it's not quite the devil that it's described at. So you have, you need to have this transfer. You need to have the development of low water usage agriculture, and you need to have regulation and enforcement. You need to have a state that is capable of enforcing things, to basically make sure that the privatization is for domestic water. And, as I've said earlier, and as you well know better than I do, it's not that the situation in Yemen has improved over the last decades, it's just the situation in so many other places has deteriorated, so that they've actually worsened the situation overall.
Yeah. Yeah, no, you're right. I believe that transformation of agriculture clearly is going to be the key, at least in part, to solve the water issues of Yemen and the world. So we have 5 minutes left. So let's ask again if somebody has any comments or questions, or if they want to jump in. Please do it now. Okay. So I don't think people have comments. So
One
thank
quick
you.
question.
Oh yeah, go ahead. Sorry.
To take
Go ahead.
advantage of the last 4 minutes.
Sure.
I don't know I'm sorry if it was covered, but what is the role of Saudi Arabia with Yemen? Are they trying to have an effort to pacify the region or control? Or my understanding is that Saudi Arabia had a strategy for the peninsula itself to make sure for your own security, you don't have all these terrorists and risks that now are happening. I was just wondering whether Saudi Arabia could get involved.
Yeah, well, Saudi Arabia is deeply involved in Yemen and has been ever since the Saudi kingdom was created. I mean, they had their first war against Yemen in 1934, 2 years after they were created. So, Saudi Arabia involvement in Yemen is very, very considerable and long-lasting. And they are, as is obvious, their neighbors. And in terms of population, they're extremely similar. I mean, they have the same number of people, except that in Yemen, 90% are Yemen, 99% or say 96% are Yemenis, where in Saudi it's only about 60% who are Saudis and the rest are migrant workers. So there is a long-term interest, but to be more contemporary, when the civil war started in 2014, it became internationalized in 2015 when what was officially known as the Saudi-led coalition intervened on behalf of the government, of the internationally recognized government. And the Saudis were very much involved and, were involved particularly in all the aerial attacks. They had a much limited involvement in land, in ground fighting. But they were very involved politically, and they're also quite involved in terms of having a major major development and humanitarian program in Yemen. Now, basically, this happened in the early days of the arrival of Mohammed bin Salman in government. His father became king in January 2015, and he became Minister of Defense in March, I think, 2015. And he basically thought that he would be able to defeat this bunch of mountain backward guys with a few Kalashnikovs in a few weeks. Clearly, that turned out not to be the case. And basically, I'd say by 2019, 2020, the prime objective of Mohammed bin Salman and the Saudi regime in general was to get out of the Yemen war as fast as they could, and with as little damage to their reputation as they could, or in other words, to reduce the damage that they'd already suffered to their reputation because of that and other events, as I'm sure we know, like Khashoggi and others. So basically, I'd say from 2020, they were really, really wanting to get out. And they then started having negotiations with the Houthis. And I think for a very, very long time, the reasons these things did not materialize is basically that the Houthis kept making more demands. And the Saudis wanted to get out by keeping, without losing face completely on the issue. And I think that's and in a sense, when I'm always sounding a bit doubtful about the Houthi-Saudi agreement, is because I still think that there is a serious danger that the Houthis do not want to reach an agreement and therefore will constantly make things more difficult and make more demands. Now, as I said earlier, the Saudis have made some major concessions. I mean, the main concession has been the one of agreeing to pay the salaries after an agreement sorry, for at least 1 year of all government staff throughout Yemen, including the military and security elements of the Houthis, i.e. the people they've been fighting. So, that is a very big concession that the Saudis have made. And basically not, they also basically will acquiesce, I suppose, to whatever Yemeni agreement is reached. And whatever Yemeni agreements likely to be reached post such an international agreement would almost certainly favor the Houthis enormously, simply because the Houthis are so much more powerful and united and organized than the internationally recognized government. So regardless of what happens, I mean, there's an expectation in the West, or in the US, the UK, and others, that basically once an agreement is reached, the Saudis will be persuaded to pay up for all the development and repairs. Just as at the moment, there's this great expectation the Saudis and the Emiratis are going to rebuild Gaza, to forever and finance everything. And these expectations, I think, are erroneous for a number of reasons. One of them is political, why on earth should they? But another one is that if you look at what's happening in Saudi Arabia, and I'm at the moment working on a book on the place, so I'm quite busy in looking at it. If you look at the Saudi and the MBS, or Mohammed bin Salman, plans for Saudi Arabia in coming years, it requires massive amounts of money. Their grandiose plans of NEOM and other, I was just looking at them this morning. I mean, incredible fantasy islands of new super luxury hotels all over the Red Sea, of all places. And, NEOM and the Line and all these other, projects which look like they've come straight out of a science fiction novel, are very, very expensive. And we're also talking in an age where, hydrocarbons are not, are on the way out. Okay, very slowly, and, it's going to take a long time, but it's already happening to some extent. And indeed, they've just abandoned, Saudi just abandoned their plan to increase their production capacity from 12 to 13 million barrels per day. I mean, already they don't need the 12 capacity they've already got at the moment. I think they're producing something between 9 and 10. I forget exactly what it is. But also all of these things are working on the assumption, of a price per barrel of a minimum of $80. And, if we look at what's happening over the Red Sea situation, it seems the price has still varied between 77 and 82, 83. I mean, I don't look at this every day, but whenever I look at it, it's not risen dramatically despite the problem. And as far as I know, no tankers have been attacked. So you have, I mean, the Saudis will not stop being involved in Yemen. There's no way. They're their neighbors. They're very close. The historic involvement has always been there. But nor should the Saudis be expected to pay up for absolutely everything. They won't do it, even if they say that. I mean, if you look, for example, at the billion they were supposed to pay to support the central bank and that they promised in early 2022, and I think actually they've offered more than $1 billion more than once. I'd have to look back at the figures. But the last tranche of billion, which I think was promised last summer, they've paid 250 million whenever it was in September, and another similar amount a few weeks ago. So, we're a long way, and that's another reason why, if you look at the internationally recognized government, it's in major, major financial crisis, all the time. So, and I think the thing to look at, I mean, maybe for you, but generally internationally, is not just what's happening between Saudi and Yemen, but is also what's happening between Saudi and the UAE, because the rivalry between those two, which started being seen in Yemen, in 2017, 2018, has expanded and developed in different areas, and is now much more visible, but it's still there in Yemen, and Yemen may still be its main physical focus. And I saw something not long ago saying that the Saudis had attacked some Emirati-supported troops, or the other way around, I forget who attacked who, militarily. So they very rarely confront each other militarily, but it has happened in Yemen. It wouldn't happen anywhere else. But you have a whole host of other issues that are, for example, the Saudis insisting that any company operating in Saudi Arabia has to have its regional headquarters in Saudi, which have started being enforced in January this year, which is basically a rivalry with Dubai and Abu Dhabi. So you have historic tensions between them, but again, let's not go back into the 19th century. We don't have to. But it seems to me that in terms of financial issues, the relationship between Saudi and UAE is something that people should watch, because I think that's more likely to cause to be internationally relevant than the relationship with Yemen, which basically is a relationship of the Saudis paying for things in Yemen and how much do they or don't they pay in Yemen. So I don't know how much that answers your question. There's plenty
Yeah,
more
very
to be
much so.
said. As I said, I'm just writing a book on Saudi, so I can go on for
Yeah.
quite a bit.
Yeah, very interesting, and thank you very much for answering in depth.
You're welcome. Oh, something's happened.
Sorry, I was on mute. So I stopped sharing.
Oh.
your since we have to go. Yeah.
Yes, you
Since
do, please.
since we have to go, I just stopped sharing your beautiful picture. But so if there are no more comments or questions, I think we can leave it here, Helen. Thank you very much. This was great. It was a pleasure having you.
No, thank you.
I believe we learned a lot,
Good.
and
Hope
I
so.
think we're gonna take a lot of insights for our work in the future. So thank you, Helen.
You're welcome. Do you want me to put you on my mailing list for my thing on the environment or anything else?
Yes, please.
Because I mean, this week I'm gonna have 3 or 4 items to send. I try and do it once a month or less. So I wait till, there's enough stuff. But this week I've got a podcast coming out and an article, and then there's this environment paper. And I might circulate my performance at the British Parliament. It has this funny bit of when the government turned around and said they wouldn't consider anything to do about Gaza. Well, thank you. It's been an interesting opportunity. It would have been even nicer to come and visit Mexico, but you never know.
Maybe the next time.
Yeah. Well, thank you so much. And
Thank you.
yeah, okay. Bye-bye, everybody. And thanks for attending, and I hope you found it useful.
Yes, a lot. Thank you.
Bye.
Right. Bye.
Thank you. Thank you.
Thanks.
Thank you.